Hey folks, so I wanted to talk about leaky weirs, right? I've hinted at it in I think like 2 or 3 videos now coming up, but let's talk about leaky weirs for real. Get into a little bit more depth. I just got done installing like 5 of them and started on a 6th, and a lot more to go. So let's look at the 4 that are in the paddock that I'm in right now, and then we're not going to go off and look at the other one because it looks a lot like one of the ones that's in here, except it's a little bit bigger. But you'll get the general idea of what these are, and you'll kind of get some updates through Farm Tour Tuesdays of how they're developing throughout the season, right? I'll keep touching back in on them and we'll see how they're working. But this is just an install video. Here's how we put them in before all the grass starts growing around them, and what they're for. So if you've kept up with our farm any bit, you know that one, we're in southern Missouri, and for the last several years, we've consistently had drought problems. And our farm has fared fairly well, mostly because we're in a low, kind of boggy area, so we do pretty decent. But, I'd like to completely avoid any of that drought issue we can, and I know everybody's saying, oh, wouldn't everyone? Well, there's different permaculture strategies you can do to mitigate those, and to an extent, if you're in a position like we are that is a boggier area and collects water, you can avoid drought. Like that's not a crazy idea, unless it is an entire season of drought. But we never get that. We get rain in the spring, and we get loads and loads of rain, and then nothing, right? Well, we used to intermittently get some showers throughout the summer. Now we're not getting a whole lot of those. So we work to build soil carbon, and that's fantastic, and it reduces runoff. But by about February, so about now, if you've been keeping up with Farm Tour Tuesday, you know that some of our sections of field, because we keep our pigs outside all year round, it can get a bit muddy. Like this is muddy season. So we want to stop any erosion that's happening when we do get these crazy spring rains. The soil that is exposed, because there's exposed soil that we can't get bales of hay to and straw to, which we work to spread as much as we can. We've put on our 6-acre farm, only about 4 or 5 acres of it is actually being grazed. We've put out 18 round bales this year. So we're doing our best to keep the ground covered where we can. So, and that's not everywhere, right? That we can't hit all of it. I feel like I'm just repeating myself there, but we cannot manage to cover all of it and still keep our pigs out. And I refuse to put the pigs up in a barn all winter like a lot of people do to try to mitigate this. Maybe there's definitely some benefits to that, but I like knowing that the pigs are out and in the sunshine when it's a nice warm day, and that they do get to find some grass and stuff to keep themselves entertained and graze throughout the whole season. So that tangent aside, it creates the problem of the ground out here is muddy, right? So while we're working to build that soil organic matter, I want to stop that erosion. And one way to stop that erosion beyond just covering the soil, right, which we're already trying to do, is to take these low areas that we have through our farm, which we have I've pointed it out in several other videos. Like you can look back at the, what does drought look like on our farm? That video kind of points out some of these low areas. Last week's Farm Tour Tuesday pointed out those low areas. You can look at the map on our farm and it shows the low areas on our farm. We're going to look at the big one that runs through. This is the main channel that everything all the smaller channels divert to and then run off the farm. We're going to look at that, and that's where I'm focusing my efforts on putting these weirs. We're putting them in along here first, and then moving out and hitting those other ones to stop water higher up on the landscape. I want to kind of hit these as like the first stop. Like this is where we're losing topsoil, we're losing fertility, and creating pollution, right? Like that is excessive amounts of organic matter and phosphorus and nitrogen that is running off our farm. So we want to stop that. And then we're going to work on trapping the moisture higher up, which is where we'll really get those main benefits from drought stress. So let's flip you around and look at these weirs. All right, so we've had a good amount of rain the last several days, as we do in spring. So you can see how boggy this area is. And then this is where that kind of section starts in. We've got, you can see that shiny spot back there. That is kind of where it starts onto our property from everybody else's. And then it runs from there down. You can kind of see where it dips. And then at an angle ties into there. And then runs off through here and down and back. Okay. and then leaves at that corner brace over there. And it's off our farm and runs off down to a creek that then or across several fields and then ties into a creek, then ties into the river. So, but we've got another one in that paddock, and it snakes down, hits, runs through and down and ties in, and then back over there it does the same thing, snakes, hits that pond, water from everyone else hits that pond thing, which is really just a deeper low water area. It dries up in the summer, and then flows down and through. Okay, so we're going to be building weirs for this main one starting up there, so we catch all the water coming from everyone else's property, all staggered along, following this all the way down. Okay, and then we'll be building them along that little drainage that leads, and the first one we built was up there, and it'll follow that drainage and then that drainage. So nearly every paddock except for paddock number 6 here, which is this hill, will have a leaky weir. Now let's go ahead and look at these weirs and talk a little bit about them. So the first thing to consider is these are not dams, okay? They are not even swales. Their goal is not to stop water, which even a swale is only meant to like short-term stop water. So if there was a something that was similar to this, a swale would be it, but a swale is made out of soil and is on contour. These are not, they're not on contour. They're really, well, they're kind of on contour, but they're not really. Because if they were, right, they would arch way back here and come longer out. So yeah, no, they're not on contour, but they are parallel to the flow of, or perpendicular to the flow of water. And they're not meant to fully stop water like a dam would be, or even like a swale is. A swale catches and traps that water so that it can slowly seep in. And that is what these do to an extent, but they're not as efficient at it as a swale. A swale would dam up all the water until it runs over the top, okay? So that will trap tons and tons of water. These guys, their purpose is just to act as a kind of a stopper. So the water hits them, you can see there are gaps, there are chinks, right? It's essentially, it does what happens to a creek if a big tree falls over it, right? Tree falls over, and then all the brush collects against it as everything flows, and it kind of short-term dams it up for a few years until it rots down and goes away. But there's so much flow that it stops. There's not as much flow, and you can see, since it's not really going right now, but you can see that water is kind of currenting through. That's what those lines are. It's where I've walked through and stirred up the mud, but the water is still attempting to make its way through, and it slows down at each of these, and they're just now established, so they're not really doing as much as they're going to be doing. What will happen throughout the summer is the grass is going to grow up, right, all up against these, and it will be much harder for animals to get the grass right up against them. And so when the rain flows, that grass is going to create a screen and hit against it. So not only will the boards and sticks slow it down, and the willows, so we planted willows on the back sides. These are our field cutting willows, so they will get pollarded. And in coming years, what will happen is when these are pollarded, every time that they're trimmed, I'll just throw the branches down at the base. So it'll build it back up every year with the cuttings from them, right? So all summer, the pigs will have the shade along these. They'll have extra wet spots, so they'll dig this out and kind of wallow these areas, but then we'll be throwing all the sticks against it so that every year it gets new material. So purpose is to slow down and filter out sediment and slow that water down as it goes through. So then the water has longer to seep into the subsoil and hopefully refill. It's not really going to refill the aquifer out here too much because we have a clay hard pan 30 inches down, but it will to an extent, right? It will as it seeps over to everybody else's farm under the ground as groundwater. Once it hits the edge of that hard pan, then it will go down to the aquifer. And that's what we want. We want groundwater. So then the plants have access to that all season and it doesn't just evaporate or run off. So slow down, filter out water. Now, there are several different ways to do this. The ways that I found watching a bunch of Australian videos, because man, I don't know what their deal is, but the Australians seem to figure stuff out real fast. And then it takes a few years before it manages to make it up here. If you haven't listened to Charlie Arnott's Regenerative Journey podcast, huge plug for that. Love that podcast. The amount of people that he talks to out there that are doing such amazing things in the outback are super, super cool. So check that out. But some pictures that I had seen shared were like this. And now they were doing them real long and along contour. but some were just doing them in their low ditch areas and just stacking sticks and brush, right? And so this will break down pretty fast throughout a couple of seasons. And in the meantime, it will act as some bird habitat, some rodent habitat, which will then, feed our owls and raptors, which owls are raptors, but it'll feed the whole plethora of raptors that eat rodents. So yeah, piles of sticks, long contour with stuff at the back to kind of stop them up. You could put sticks on both sides, vertical, to hold it in place, make it more like a dead hedge. But I'm kind of relying on the fact that water is going to be pushing it up against those. Those trees will grow in, they'll thicken, they'll get stronger with time versus weaker like stakes would, right? So that's one option if you just have a bunch of brush laying around. Or we've got all this old rotten wood that we pulled up from some garden beds. So we're using it. It's cedar for the most part. And we're putting it, untreated cedar, although we do have some treated wood that's like 30 years old. So it's starting to really break down. So I think most of anything that's in it is going to have leached out by this point, because they're pretty well rotten apart. So they're no longer rot resistant. So this is one style where I just laid them down, very similar to that. Just laid them down with the willows at the backs to hold them in place as water goes through. They're going to break down. So that probably won't be as effective as that one, right? And neither of those I think is going to be as effective as these other two. So this one is just one high, two thick, and they're rotting 2x6s that are cedar, right? And so water will get through that center, but that's going to plug up fairly quick. And I think it's going to rot down pretty fast because it's not very tall. But then the next one we did here was too high, too thick. And you can see they're not perfect ones, they're rotted. I'm not using like fantastic boards for this, but I wanted to do kind of all the ones in this paddock slightly different to just see throughout the season how these break down, how they work, how they function. So, and then this one is not done yet. This one will be pretty stout because it catches a lot from this whole area, and it will probably, I'm like falling in the mud here, it'll wrap around quite a ways to try to trap as much of this floodplain right here as possible. So yeah, and then like I said, we're gonna keep working our way up and around through there. That's it. So I hope that makes sense. I hope that wasn't too terribly long-winded as to what we're attempting to do with this. And it definitely seems crazy to be like slogging through mud thinking, oh, I want to trap all of this water right now when, like the biggest struggle right now is everything is muddy and wet. So I know the like general thought pattern is, oh my gosh, there's too much water. We need this water out of here so that it's not a problem. And I'm sitting here going, hey, I'm going to like trap all this water and make it muddier. But I know that come drought season, when that happens, I'm going to be super grateful that we trapped all this water on here when we did, because it will be trapped in the soil where the plants can actually use it. So, all right. And you can keep up with that. Like I said, I'll check in on Farm Tour Tuesdays and we'll just kind of touch base on those and see how they're doing in the coming weeks and coming months, actually, as they hit in through season. We can see how they worked. We can see during drought whether or not there is still more grass in these areas or not, like I've seen pictures of. But yeah, I hope that's helpful. I hope you can implement that on your farm in some form or fashion. Thank you to our Patreon supporters, Raymond and Ashley Hunter. And thank you to all of you that watch our videos. I hope you get useful content out of this and that it helps you make your farms more sustainable and economically viable for you. So have a great week.